Right. If you don't practice these skills, then you're just going to get pushed around by your emotions. It's just as simple as that. And so you have to decide for sure. I think it's definitely a personal choice. Like you said, I think you have to decide that it's important and that you want to have greater control over how you act and the decisions that you make and what's influencing those decisions. And so I think it's probably not for everybody, and I'm okay with that. I think, but I think it should be for everybody, because if you want to live a happy life, I mean, beyond just being a great leader, if you want to live a happy life, I mean, understanding and working with your emotions is critical to that end.
Before we get to today's guest, let me take a moment to thank you for being a listener to the weekly podcast. Our focus on leadership development means that we're relevant to a fairly unique audience. We don't generate a lot of controversy or hyperbole, but we do care about the future of leadership in business, in society, in government. And we talk about issues that matter with people who have unique, deeply informed perspectives. And so I want you to know that I appreciate those of you who come back week after week. And if you click on the subscribe button, you'll get notified each time we post a new episode. And so, speaking of people who have unique, deeply informed perspectives, today we're having a conversation with Ryan Heinl, who's the CEO of SIY Global, a science-based learning company that delivers world-class emotional intelligence programs built on a unique blend of neuroscience and mindfulness to create high-performing workplaces where people and businesses can flourish. Now, I know some of you are going to hear the term emotional intelligence and think, oh man, this, been there, done that. But Ryan has a unique take on the subject with a foundation in industrial and organizational psychology and over 20 years at the intersection of executive assessment, leadership development, and technology. He and his team translate science and technology into scalable solutions that drive measurable business results. They help organizations build leaders who thrive in complexity and ambiguity. And if you're focused on building leaders for the future, you're going to love this conversation. And so, Ryan, welcome to Leadership Disrupted. And just to fill in the picture of who you are or who your organization is there anything you'd like to share right away before we deep dive into the conversation?
I think the only thing first of all, it's great to be here, Dan. And the only thing I would add to that is that about the last, I would say, decade or so of my career has really been focused on product management in the leadership space. And so I'm really preoccupied with really difficult, challenging leadership problems that organizations are trying to solve. And that's ultimately what led me to SIY Global and to the leadership position I'm in there now.
And that's actually what grabbed my attention, because as I'm focusing on what kind of leaders do we need today and mostly tomorrow as we get to 26, 27, 2030, what is the world needing in terms of leadership? And there's no question that emotion-powered leadership is becoming more and more critical. But I think it's an area where a lot of us are struggling. And so, I may even in this conversation use some kind of old school language, because I grew up in the days of emotional intelligence training. So forgive me in advance if I kind of fall into some of those old assumptions or old language, and feel free to correct me, or feel free to at least guide me toward maybe a new way of thinking.
Will do.
And that leads me to the first question, which is, what do a lot of us get wrong when we're thinking about emotional intelligence, EQ versus IQ? What do a lot of us get wrong as we're thinking about that?
It's a great question, and it's an important one. It's the one that I think about a lot, and the reason that I'm doing what I'm doing these days. So over the last 20 years, as an organizational psychologist, I studied what makes people really good at doing their work, especially leaders. And what I found was that there are a couple of categories that we typically focus on in terms of skill sets that we're trying to develop. So one is obviously technical skills. That's usually the one that gets rewarded probably the most, at least initially in someone's career. And then as someone moves into the higher levels of leadership, it's the other skills. It's the coaching, the delegating, the strategic thinking, all those kinds of things, which are a little less tangible in nature. But over time, what I started to see is that as we're training leaders in, let's just say, for example, something simple like delegation, it takes me a very short amount of time to train a high-performing leader on how to delegate effectively, like the mechanics, the behaviors. But that's not what prevents them from delegating effectively. What prevents them from delegating effectively is fear. Usually it's, I'm afraid that this person's not going to do as good of a job, or maybe I'm afraid that they're going to do a better job than I'm going to do. And so those are the things that are really preventing people, or trust is obviously a factor in delegation as well. And that's, I would categorize that as an emotion. And the same is true of things like strategic decision-making. If you go out and you talk to leaders about what keeps them from moving forward on a strategic decision, it's not because they don't weigh the pros and cons and have the decision matrix and all those kinds of things. They know how to do all that stuff. They know how to analyze. What keeps them from doing that is they're concerned that, they're afraid that they're going to make the wrong decision, or that they don't have enough information, or all kinds of other things. So it's an emotion driving a behavior. The more I looked into that, the more I started to realize that the neurobiological research shows very clearly that the majority of our actions as human beings are driven by emotion. So if you think of that as a performance factor, there are almost no organizations that are addressing that lever as a performance factor. They're just trying to manage it or even get rid of it if possible. Like, let's just look at the data and not talk about emotions at all is often what I'll hear. And that's just not realistic. And it's also a missed opportunity.
Right. You mentioned delegation, and I've had a lifelong battle with delegation. And I've even, come to a point where I realized that at a certain point that there was a trust issue, that I was struggling to delegate because I didn't trust that the work would be done the way I want it to be done, or on the timeline that it needed to be done. But I still struggled. I
Sure.
gave myself tasks. I forced myself to delegate, and I hated it. And it wasn't until I really put my finger on the emotional, for me, the true emotional point. And there was just a point where I'd been thinking about this for some time, and I realized what I fear most is embarrassment. That for me, and I'm not saying that's true of everybody. I'm saying for me, it was that fear of delegating something, and then because my team is responsible for it, or my group is responsible for it, ultimately not landing well with a client, or not landing well with some other audience, and me feeling ownership of that not landing well. And that was a realization for me. It still took quite a bit to become a more effective delegator. And part of it was consciously working to let go of the embarrassment, to accept that I am thinking through this, I am delegating it, and it might not land 100% with the client the way I want it to land, but it still ends up being better for that person, better for the organization, and better for the client if it gets delivered at 95%, but it's done on time and it's good enough, versus 100%, but we're 3 weeks late, or 100%, and we're still waiting for Dan, to get off his butt and get the work done.
Or maybe they do it completely different from how you would have done it, but it's actually better.
And then I worry, and we get presented. It gets presented to the client, and it's perfectly fine. In fact, the client is thrilled, and it's done in a way that I would never even imagine. But man, you are so right in terms of what what I think was driving it, what I thought was driving it in terms of logically, it's all about quality. Logically, it's all about customer centricity. Logically, it's about these things. But in reality, what was getting in the way was that emotion of that fear. It's actually that fear of embarrassment. Um, and I'm sure that's just one tiny little sliver of an example.
That's a great example, though. Yeah, that's a really great illustration.
How do you help organizations or leaders, I guess, develop that kind of awareness?
Well, I think you touched on one way as you were giving your example, actually, because that examination of what specific emotion you were feeling is a key component in really understanding what's going on, and then being able to use that emotional information as another data point.
Yeah.
So I think a challenge for most leaders in business is they look on emotions as noise, whereas that emotion is going to drive your behavior whether you want it to or not. And so it's better to understand what the emotion is driving so that you can then make appropriate decisions about how to deal with that, just like you did in that example, which I think was perfect. You thought about, okay, I'm concerned about being embarrassed, and I like how you got down to a much more specific, granular level with the emotion you were feeling there, because that's another thing that is very helpful, is really understanding what you're feeling, because in your case, you illustrated it beautifully. Being embarrassed about something is very different from being, let's say, worried
Yeah,
about something.
but it took 3 years. Oh, it was more than 3 years. It took years. I wish I'd had, I don't know, a coach, a therapist, somebody to peel the layers away, because I'm, I mean, I'm not, I'm not someone who thinks that I care that much about what other people think. In fact, I have often said, look, I care about doing good work. I don't care that much about what people think of the work, as long as I think it's good work.
Hmm.
But I realized that's not true. It's actually not true.
Probably
It's
not.
almost it's almost like, I don't know, being on a school playground and saying, I don't care what that bully thinks of me. But in fact, you're just saying that defensively. You really do care. But
Yeah.
man, there are a lot of layers to something, to that.
Yeah,
And
because that older part of your brain, the emotional system in your brain it's much older, it's much higher powered in your brain. The prefrontal cortex relatively new, right, and slower. Like if you know
mhm,
anything about Daniel Kahneman's work on thinking fast and slow, he talks all about that. So in order to get a better handle on that, doing things like really getting more granular with understanding the emotion, using there are many techniques for doing this, but one of the techniques that we teach is mindfulness, for creating just a small buffer between when you feel something and when you act. So most often, the reason that emotions drive so much of our behavior is that we're not realizing that it's actually doing that. We're
yeah,
justifying it after the fact, just like you did in your example. So it feels like a very logical choice that we're making, but in actuality, the emotional systems are driving that type of behavior. We're just justifying it. So creating, training yourself, and it is training, just like training any other muscle, to create a little bit of room between your emotional reaction, which is very fast and very efficient because of all the evolution that we've had
mhm,
over the millennia, that has reinforced the importance of that emotional system to keep us alive. Creating that space allows us to then inject that logical thinking that we think we're doing, but we're actually not
yeah,
most of the time. And then you can make an informed choice, like, oh, I'm concerned about being embarrassed by this. So maybe that's okay. Maybe I should be concerned about being embarrassed, but maybe not. And maybe that doesn't help me
mhm.
to achieve what I actually want to achieve, which is a different outcome.
Well, my little brain just made a connection. I'm going to test it on you because it may be valid or not. But you mentioned Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow is essentially part of what you're saying is feeling fast and slow. Like no matter what, we feel typically emotions very quickly, but if we give ourselves a beat to rethink the emotion or to reprocess the emotion or just validate or invalidate, or maybe tell a new story about the emotion. Because that I do remember that there's that moment of realization that it's about embarrassment or the fear of embarrassment. And that by giving it a name helped me kind of back up and rethink why I'm doing what I'm doing. But I don't know, does the phrase feeling fast and slow, does that resonate at all?
I like that. Yeah. Feeling fast and slow. Yeah. I like that a lot. That's a good way. That's a good way of putting it, I think, is um, giving yourself that time to really understand what is being conveyed by your emotions, and then using that information, however you choose to use it. You can agree with it. You can decide
Yeah.
that's not the most useful thing to do, or, whatever you choose to do. It's just another data point.
I think the more we become aware of the complexity within ourselves, the more we also then can become aware of the complexity within others, so that we start to read people better, become more empathetic and sensitive to not just our impact on others, but what they're going through as well. And I would love to hear maybe some of your insight or perspective on the workplace today, because the workplace is shifting. I think if you had this focus 20 years ago, you would have gotten traction, but not nearly as much as you might get today, because the workplace is so emotionally challenging for a lot of people. I don't want to say just younger generations, but particularly younger generations are challenged with their own emotions coming into the workplace. A lot of them, they're not that into their jobs. They're not that into the work environment. They're not that into their leaders. They're not that into their colleagues, but they need a career, want a career, and are struggling, I don't know, to find the fire. And if you can't align your emotional power with your work, I don't know where you're going to get the power from, or to get the fire from. Does that prompt any thoughts?
Yes, I think there's a bunch of things coming together right now that are making the understanding and the skill set around emotions increasingly important. I think the younger generations, they are just a lot more comfortable, I think, talking about emotions. So I don't know that I wouldn't say that they're unique in experiencing those emotional challenges. I think they're just a lot more comfortable talking about it, and they want to talk about it, even in the workplace. Whereas I think normatively in the past, it's kind of like, you're at work now, so you need to leave your emotions at home.
Oh man, and first 20 years of my career, I don't think I ever said I'm having a bad day. Not that I didn't have bad days, but I never would have said, or I would have never said, "Hey, I need to take a mental health day."
Right. Yeah.
And I think so. I do think it's great that we are more open to that kind of communication. But I do think maybe leaders of my generation struggle with how do you respond. I actually had a gentleman. He's a few years younger than I am, but in one of our conversations, he said, I froze because one of my employees during our quarterly performance review and kind of one-on-one session, the employee mentioned that they had recently been diagnosed with a generalized anxiety disorder, and they were on medication now. And the fact that the employee felt comfortable sharing that with him, intellectually, he thought, okay, that's good. I mean, that's openness. In fact, if we were being really transparent, I might ask him, well, what medication? Because it might be good to know what medication are you on, and then I could maybe Google that and have a sense of how that might be helping you. But he said, I froze. I didn't ask anything. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid to say the wrong thing.
Mm.
And he said, and it's one of those situations where once the moment passes, I can't bring it up again. I can't, like the next time we're talking, I can't say, hey, by the way, I've been thinking about your medication. No, like I missed the moment, and I need to know, well, how should I respond if things like that happen in the future? I just think it's a new world of work
It
where
is.
there are new comfort zones that we're all getting used to.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the younger generations, I mean, I don't want to be dismissive of their challenges. They do have some acute challenges. They have some of the highest levels of depression of any generation previous to them. They have, they have grown up on social media, which I think creates its own challenges for them, digital media in general. And so, but I agree with you. I think as managers, I think for sure we feel not very equipped to handle this because it's not something that has been part of
Right.
the workplace in the past, and now suddenly it is. And I think also at the same time, if you look at the rate of change that's happening in organizations, I think Gartner released a report. I think it was in 2022 now, so it's a few years old, but they looked back at the number of organizational changes that were happening in 2016, and it was 2 on the average. And in 2022, it was 10. So that was 2022. So you can imagine what it is now. And so that intensity of change, plus just everything that's going on in the world is changing faster. It's not just within organizations. It's just this, increasing amount of intensity. And so I think it requires a new set of skills for people in the workplace to handle all of that, and also for leaders to support them in all of those things. And I think it's understandable to feel, for the leaders to feel uncertain and a little bit afraid, maybe even to try to approach those topics, and I've had my own personal experience. I mean, I had a really talented employee at SIY who had a new baby. This is actually something I think a lot of people don't talk about, but he had sort of what I would call postpartum depression as a father, and really struggled with it. Luckily, I'm a dad, and I totally identified with what he was feeling. And so he and I were able to talk openly about the challenges that he's having. And in the end, we decided that it would probably make sense for him to take a few months of leave, so that he had decided to get on medication, and we knew it was going to take a while for that medication to have an effect. So we gave him some time to just, rest and not worry about work for a while. I'm not saying that's always the right thing to do, is to kind of just check out and go do something else for a while. But in his case, I think it was. And then when he came back, he was even more productive by far than he was when he was dealing with that stuff. So
even though the willingness on both sides to have that transparent conversation, that's such a huge thing. Because, if I remember back 25 years ago when we had our son, oh man, but those were the days where you just suck it up. You suck it up and you just put your head down and you do whatever it needs to be done. And I know I would have been a better father. I would have been a better husband. I would have been a better employee if instead I had actually acknowledged what was going on, and then had people I could feel safe talking to about that. I also have a lot of empathy for the younger generations because I don't want to derail this conversation, but I'll share a quick story. This goes back a year and a half, 2 years ago. Saturday morning, I'm having breakfast and coffee with 2 other gentlemen. We're all about the same age, middle-aged and older white guys, and we're exactly what you would expect in terms of complaining about younger generations. We were saying the things like old men sitting on or standing on a front porch with our canes going, if only they knew how hard it was when I was first working. And then one of the men spoke up and he said, I think that if we were experiencing our formative years the way they're experiencing their formative years now, if what we experienced was a system that doesn't seem to work for us, where no matter how hard we work, we can't actually afford a new house, can't actually afford a family the way our parents could afford a family. We don't seem to be getting ahead year by year, where it seems like the entire world isn't working. And it's not just the work culture, it's the culture around the work culture and then the culture around that. And it seems like sometimes the world is going crazy. And it seems, and all you have to do is work in an Amazon warehouse and have somebody tracking your productivity day by day, and then coming to you and saying, hey, your deliverables are down by 2 percentage points this week. We're gonna have to do something about that. While you go home and go to Instagram, and there's Jeff Bezos with his new wife, just recently spending $50 million on a wedding in Italy as they sail away on their $600 million ship. And that's not to begrudge anyone of anything, except that, like you said, social media puts it all in our faces. Social media seems to tell us every other young man's driving a Bugatti. Every other young man is 8% body fat. Right. Everyone's living these amazing lives, and I'm just mentioning a couple of issues, but the guy's point was, if we were getting formed in this environment, we might be experiencing the exact same thing.
Sure.
We at least had the illusion that the system works. Whether it actually worked or not, we had the illusion that it works. So we all kind of bought into, hey, keep your nose down, do your work, and the rewards will be yours if you are working hard enough and smart enough, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I think that illusion has been ripped away.
Yep.
And so I have empathy for younger generations. Also, I remember I assumed I could trust my leaders. I assumed, you take a job, and until someone lies to you or until somebody does something bad, you actually start with an assumption of trust. I don't think that's the way it works today. They start with the assumption of, I need to watch out for all of you. It's up to you to prove to me that I can trust you, earn my trust, as opposed to I give it and then possibly have.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think that's true.
So all of those things have an emotional element to them.
Absolutely.
And it's so complicated. I can imagine some leaders even listening to this podcast and go, it's just too much. Let's just focus on our KPIs, our OKRs, our key projects, our timelines, because I just don't have the capacity to navigate all of these, emotion-driven waters. I don't know. Do you ever experience that? Or I know I just loaded a lot on. Sorry about that. But how do you talk leaders through the importance of navigating emotions as well as intellect in the workplace?
I think it is probably pretty overwhelming when you start talking to leaders about this stuff. And the place that I usually direct them to start with is just very simply, let's just try to understand your own emotions first. Let's just start there. Just, like you did with your example at the beginning, let's just do some work to understand your own emotions, understand the things that you are wrestling with, work on creating some space between your thoughts and your emotions and your reaction to things. Let's just start there, because you can't understand someone else's emotions unless you understand your own.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. It's just emotional awareness, emotional regulation. Let's just start with that, and then we can go to the next step, which is kind of more advanced things, understanding other people's emotions, using emotions as information, accepting things so that you can move toward a solution on something, and realizing that you have an emotional block that's holding you back from doing those things. And I think these days, you mentioned that at the beginning that emotional intelligence has been around for a long time, and it has, about 20 years or so now. The more recent work in neuroscience has shown us that Whereas previously, I think everyone thought we all experienced the same emotions: sadness, happiness, fear, so on.
Yeah.
But the reality is that our emotions are actually constructed based upon our past experiences and our beliefs. So we're all seeing a slightly different version of reality. And so I think as a leader, it's really important to understand that not everyone, especially when you get into generational differences, that generation has a completely different set of experiences, like you just pointed out, that has formed literally the way that they view what's real in the world. And so I think understanding that we all have a slightly different psychology can be helpful in terms of getting leaders to understand that stuff. The second piece of advice I usually give to leaders is just start with curiosity. Just start with that every time, because you're never going to go wrong with curiosity. If someone's telling you something that feels uncomfortable to you in terms of how you can deal with it, just try to be curious about it. That's all. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to remove it. You don't have to change it. Just be curious. And that will go a long way toward building that trust and creating that relationship with that employee who's going to, then come to you in the future with support needs, which is what you want.
I have a client. I was doing some executive coaching for a client, and his what had prompted the coaching engagement was over the previous couple of years, his feedback from employees had shifted, and the way he described it to me, he said he built his career on being Mr. Enthusiasm. He was the enthusiastic person in the workplace. He was the enthusiastic cheerleader, leader. He celebrated people. He was Mr. Energy, and that worked for him, and he had a very successful career. And he said something shifted, and he said it was maybe around the pandemic, but it was around that time. And he said, now the feedback that I'm getting, and it's not from the same people. It's so the feedback I'm getting from the younger employees mostly is now the cheerleading. Even the term cheerleading is now a pejorative. It's now critical. It's whereas when I was younger, being called the cheerleader was a good thing. Now it's a bad thing. Mr. All hat and no cattle. Mr. All style and no substance, or all sizzle and no substance. And he said, I'm struggling because that's my go-to skill. And now it seems like my go-to skill is landing differently with these different people. And to your point, they see the world through a different set of lenses. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't be passionate or enthusiastic, but it might mean learning how to adjust, how to evolve to a level of cheerleading or enthusiasm that's that they will actually get, that they will actually trust.
Yeah.
So the more we talk about this, the more here's where my internal dialogue goes. How do you build any kind of training business around this? Because it's so complicated. I mean, I could see building a therapy business, like one-on-one therapy, but and I'm not saying you can't, obviously you are, but so I guess my question is, how do you operate this as a business where you've got scalability and you can provide value in a way that also is profitable, for the organization?
Sure. Well, what we most often do is when we come into an organization, I think they really have to be ready for this, first of all, and they need to have, often, a lot of times we'll get brought in because there are some passionate people within the organization who have a lot of interest in changing the culture and wanting, they might have a personal motivation to want to help people in this way. And so we often will help them to try to make it connected to the business outcomes. So if a company is trying to create a certain brand experience, obviously increasing everyone's empathy is in service of that brand experience, because then you can connect better with customers in a certain way. But but we'll often train internal instructors to deliver these programs. So we really believe in what's called a blended spaced learning approach to these things. So we'll always have some type of insight tool initially to help people to understand where they are, where are they starting from in terms of these skills. And then we'll often have some online courses that'll give them the basic concepts that we're going to be training on. So our main course in emotional intelligence is called Emotional Dynamics. And when they go through that course, they'll learn about managing emotions, emotional awareness, and what we call constructive empathy. Those are the key concepts that they learn in those online courses. And then what we'll do is have 2 instructor-led courses. And we really believe in the instructor-led portion of that. We think people need to come together, practice, wrestle with these concepts, have the kinds of discussions like you and I have been having. And the facilitator is critical to that experience. And so they'll have one session where they'll practice and learn some of those concepts. They get a homework assignment, and then they have a second session, talk about how they're applying it in the workplace. What are they wrestling with? A lot of times they'll come back and say, leaders will come back and say things like, how can I have empathy and not look weak to my employees? So we'll talk about that. Like, let's unpack it and talk about how that comes up and how do we deal with it. And then after that, we'll have usually a series of challenges that we'll send them so they can apply it in the workplace. So maybe the first challenge is just practice pausing before you make a decision. Just try to create some space. And then the next thing might be, now let's try to do that in real time in a meeting. You're having a conversation and you feel something. How can you pause that for just a moment, just long enough to understand what's going on, incorporate that information, and then respond. And then we might go to the next level, which is maybe more complex decision making. How can we think about what you're feeling, what others might be feeling about this decision? Because there's always emotions involved. And so if you're not acknowledging them and combining that with the informational data, then you're missing a big part of it. If you think about why people make the decisions that they make, like I said, it's usually not the data. It's the data comes after. So that's kind of generally how we do it, is that format, that blended space learning approach, which works really well for adults. And that over the course of that process, it breaks things down into smaller pieces, and then each component then reinforces and builds upon the last component.
I really like the idea of embedding the trainers within the organization as subject matter experts, to give it, ongoing, permanent life, as opposed to
relevant to the organization.
But what I also hear is the need to slow down a bit. Like, we're so used to attending a training session and then coming out of that session fixed. All right, I learned the 5 points of storytelling. So now I'm going to tell my sales pitch or my other stories. I'm going to tell them following these 5 steps. Or I learned the 3 pillars of influence, or I learned the 8 principles of whatever, and I come out having mastered those, and I'm going to apply them very tactically.
Right.
Yes, sir. And we move on.
You got the checklist. Yeah.
This feels much more like I come out of a session with a lot of food for thought and a lot of thinking that has to happen, or hopefully happens, and then layer upon layer upon layer, creating greater awareness and capability, and giving people a reason to pause, a reason to slow down, a reason to pay more attention. I think that's great. I wonder sometimes, how realistic is that when we're so overwhelmed? Ping, 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 ping. There's just so much happening in the workplace. I guess you have to decide that this emotional aspect of your being is important enough to pay attention to it, and important enough to slow down for it. Because if you don't make that decision, you're going to quickly just get sucked into the maelstrom of that day-to-day activity.
Right. If you don't practice these skills, then you're just going to get pushed around by your emotions. It's just as simple as that. And so you have to decide for sure. I think it's definitely a personal choice. Like you said, I think you have to decide that it's important and that you want to have greater control over how you act and the decisions that you make and what's influencing those decisions. And so I think it's probably not for everybody, and I'm okay with that. I think, but I think it should be for everybody, because if you want to live a happy life, I mean, beyond just being a great leader, if you want to live a happy life, I mean, understanding and working with your emotions is critical to that end. So I think,
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine, maybe not always, but most of the time, it should start from the top down. If we don't see some degree of emotional health above us, I imagine that
yeah,
that's what creates the space for the rest of us to evolve. But I mean, is that right? Is that wrong?
yes, I totally agree. It definitely needs to start at the top of the organization as a priority for the organization. I think we're seeing that more and more. You look at people like Mark Benioff, and I believe the CEO of Nike has a mindfulness practice, and I think it's increasingly it's about making the connection between, oh, this thing I do when I'm not at work, this mindfulness stuff that I do, or yoga or whatever it is, this actually has a very useful application in terms of the work that I do and helping me to better understand and moderate and use my emotions to the benefit of the organization. So, yes, it needs to be, in order for it to be really effective, it needs to be a cultural shift that's driven by the leaders at the top of the organization. I suspect that as AI becomes, more ingrained in the workplace and everything that we do, that'll also drive a lot of the change in terms of people focusing more on the emotional aspects, because you just won't be able to avoid the need for people to connect with people. There's already a lot of backlash on, oh, this is AI. I don't want to talk to AI. There's a chat bot or something like that. I know I feel it. I don't, and I know my kids feel it. My kids are teenagers and they don't want to talk to a chat bot either.
Right.
So I think there's a premium that's going to be placed on working directly with a human being. And so if you want to create a unique brand experience, which creates connection between that customer and your organization, it's going to come from those human interactions. And so people need to be very adept at doing that.
So I noticed a couple of years ago that our best salespeople, when I was tagging along with them on sales calls, either virtual sales calls or sometimes face-to-face sales calls, and I was watching the various interactions, the most productive conversations had a certain lighthearted spirit to them. There was almost always a bit of humor. Sometimes it was making fun of ourselves or making fun of the situation, or there's just turns of phrase that were amusing. But there was a little bit of laughter, and I guess I'll call it a lightness. There was a lightness to it, and I was struggling to explain to other salespeople what I was seeing, but I could almost smell a call that wasn't going to go particularly well, because it was just so correct. It was just so okay. Mr. Customer, I'm nice to meet you. Let me ask 2 or 3 open-ended questions, because I was trained to ask open-ended questions, and then let me tell you about myself, and I'll give you my background, because that's what I was trained to do, and then I'm going to open up my PowerPoint deck, and we're going to go through my pitch, and I'm making it a little more robotic than it was, but it was all very correct. And what I saw with the more successful sales reps was sometimes they didn't even get to the PowerPoint deck. Sometimes there were a lot of things that they technically missed, But what they did have was that connection, that rapport, and it was genuine. It was authentic. Um, they found ways to have things in common.
Right.
Oh, and then another thing that I noticed was that with the less successful reps, they operated at a certain pace, and it was that pace all the time. That was just their pace, not a bad pace, not a good pace, always. But what I saw with these other reps was they adjusted. If they were talking to, kind of a fast thinking, fast talking customer, they were bam, 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 dialing up with them, or slowing down and going easy, and all of that. As I think through it in emotional terms, it was emotional awareness. It was reading the room, getting a sense of what's happening in this room, and then aligning with the energy of the room. And sometimes the energy is really jokey and fun, and sometimes not so much. Um, for I think a lot of those more successful reps that came naturally, and I don't know what the key is to, I don't know what the kind of childhood is that creates that naturally, but maybe there is a proper way of parenting. Maybe it's partly genetics. I don't know, but I can see how if you are able to, and I'm just assuming since this is the business you're in, you are able to, if you're able to dial up awareness of oneself and then awareness of others, and then make that truly like actionable. That's huge. That's got to be huge. You must have some stories of seeing people go from 0 to 100 or 20 to 95 in terms of their emotional efficacy in the workplace.
Absolutely, yeah. I think what you're describing is they're making an emotional connection there. Those salespeople that are really high performing, they're deepening the conversation becomes subtly deeper, even though there's joking and things like that, but it becomes subtly deeper over the course of the conversation most of the time. And what you see at the end is that probably by the end of the conversation, they're talking about each other's kids, where they're going to school and where they bought their first house and stuff like that. And that is really, call it building rapport, call it building emotional connection. But it's really coming from, like you're saying, empathizing with that other person, making them feel like they're understood, and deepening the understanding and reflecting those back. It's a complicated process, but that's ultimately what it comes to. So I think that's a great example.
I would hear in the context of that, one rep would say something toward the end like, "Hey, just so I don't overshoot our proposal, do you have a defined budget for this?" And because of that rapport, it just sort of flows. The information flows very, very naturally. Whereas the less effective rep would still ask the question, "Hey,
Yeah.
do you have a budget defined for this initiative?" Even the choice of that particular word, "Do you have a budget defined for this initiative?" The answer,
balloon. It's like emotionally
yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you, because you said at the beginning, it starts with self-awareness. So for anyone like listening to this podcast who might be thinking, okay, well, I think I'm self-aware. I mean, most of us think that we are until we
Right.
realize later, oh, now I'm more aware, and I realize how unaware I was then.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty
common.
Yeah. So I guess what kind of advice would you give to people in terms of at least beginning the process of kind of cracking yourself open and becoming more aware of your own emotional state?
I think the simplest thing that you can do is just try to notice when you feel something. Oftentimes you can feel something physiological. So a lot of us don't realize, most of us don't think about this, but if you ask someone to define what an emotion is, probably struggle with that definition. And it's really a physiological thing a lot of the time. Your heart quickens, you might feel some tightness, you might feel, or maybe you feel energetic in your body. But that's a good place to start, is you can just try to sense into your body when you're in a conversation. Just try to switch back and forth. Your attention is a bit like a spotlight, so you can't just like split your attention in two places. But if you just kind of go back and forth between what's happening in your body and what's happening, in front of you right now, you can just kind of monitor what's going on there. And then when you feel something, maybe just try to take a moment to take a breath. See if you can figure out what's there. What am I feeling? Am I feeling concern? Am I feeling worried? Am I feeling, and the more you do that, the more you'll get, and the more granular you are with it, the better you'll get at it. We call it emotional fluency. So you'll kind of start to develop that muscle. And then over time, you can also try to examine the thoughts that are there. So what thoughts are going along with that emotion? And then you can then try to understand what it means and does it, and what might it be driving you toward from a behavioral standpoint. And then you can decide if that's the right direction or not. You can decide how you want to, once you observe those emotions, observe those thoughts, then you can decide what's the right path for me to go down at this point based on that information. That very simple thing of just stopping, taking a breath, stopping when you notice something, taking a breath, observing what emotions and thoughts are there, and then proceeding with what you think is the best course. That alone can make a dramatic difference in terms of someone's interactions with other people in the workplace or anywhere, really.
It feels a little bit like being your own therapist in like micro doses, like taking a moment. Because if you had like a therapist at hand, you could sit down for 15 minutes and say, "Hey, I'm experiencing this," and that therapist would typically help you unpack like what's underneath that and what's underneath that and what's really driving it.
If I can just add one other thought, I think the other thing that you can do is you can try to notice your self-talk. So a lot of people I talk to will say, "Oh, well, I don't have negative self-talk," or I don't have bad self-talk. But the reality is that you're probably not really paying attention to the self-talk most of the time. So it's useful to just try to see what's going on there, because your mind is actually, this is a weird thing to say, I guess, but your mind is actually doing its own thing. Like, I don't know if you've noticed, but it's just throwing thoughts out there all the time. And if they don't come from the person that you would characterize as you. It's coming from somewhere else. So I think it's good to start paying attention to that and understand the stories and the narrative that's coming out there so that you can have a point of view, that is maybe different from what that narrative is.
It's a little scary sometimes if you really start to, I guess, open yourself up to what's going on in your own head, where there's just a lot of activity, tons of activity. And I think we're lucky if we can latch on to 20% of it and understand it and do something productive.
But the more you practice, the more you can expand the capacity to do that. That's how, neuroplasticity works. Like, the more you focus your brain on something, the more resources get dedicated to it. So it works both ways. If you're spending a lot of time thinking on negative things, of course, then your brain is going to get really efficient at noticing, negative information. So you want to focus it on something productive and focus your brain resources on something that's going to help you.
So in the business that you're in, what would be, I guess, an example of an organization or a team of people that's really primed? Like when you're having an initial conversation with somebody and they start to describe their dynamics or just their situation, whatever it might be. What kind of group causes you to go like you start mentally ticking the boxes of saying, "Oh, this actually feels very primed for the kind of work that we do." What are the indicators? What are the things that you see that give you those green lights?
Yeah, I think it varies a lot, but lately, what I will say is that there are just a lot of organizations that we work with where people are just so overwhelmed by the frequency and intensity of the changes that are happening within organizations that it is almost debilitating. And so, so when I see that, what we will often do is, unfortunately, people are ready for help at that point.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't wish that on anyone, but that's when they need help. And I think they need a new set of skills to deal with that, like we talked a little bit about before. And so that's when we'll often come in. And while we do sort of basic foundational emotional intelligence, here's, emotional awareness management, all those things, we also apply it more in a more context specific way. So when organizations are dealing with a lot of change, we tend to help them with skills related to building resilience and coping more effectively with change, understanding how their brains are responding to those changes and the different ways that they might respond given those changes. And we also try to help them quite a lot with acceptance. So we talk about acceptance in terms of, first of all, realizing there's always an awareness component, right? So realizing that there is an inherent resistance. Our as humans, our brains like predictability.
Yeah.
And so anytime something changes, that's stressful, because we're not used to it. So when that happens, we tend to resist. We tend to wish things didn't change and that we could just kind of go about our normal routine. And so there's work that actually needs to be done in order to move past that toward a solution. And that resistance actually it amplifies the stress for people. So we talk about acceptance is not just being okay with the way things are or what's going on. You don't have to agree with it, but it's about acknowledging that that is how it is. And then that opens you up. It can actually feel very freeing once you sort of accept that, yes, this is something I have to deal with, and this is the way it's going to be. And then that allows you to move toward and commit energy toward a solution. So we work with a lot of organizations right now in doing those things and helping them, which is dealing with the volume of change and uncertainty. There again, humans don't like uncertainty. We like predictability. Yeah. So uncertainty is so stressful for people. And so helping them with giving them the skills to manage that uncertainty is a big part of what we're doing right now. And we see a lot of openness to anything that will help with that right now. So that's a more acute need, but I would say for other organizations, we have customers who are going through major brand transitions. They're trying to revitalize their company, and they are realizing that emotional intelligence is a key part of that brand revitalization that they're going through in terms of how they interact with their customers, how they interact with each other. Maybe they've been very operationally focused for a while and like really hammering on efficiency. And that can create kind of a machine-like feel within an organization. And then eventually what they sort of come to realize is like, oh, people are leaving because they're not committed and they don't feel like, there's no loyalty to the organization because they feel like a cog in the machine. So that can be a big impetus for starting to focus on these things. Really any major organizational event, I would have to say, is something that kind of opens people up to new ways of doing things and the need to focus on the emotional aspects. And when you look at a lot of the data out there these days about what makes transformation successful, you always hear about the 70 to 90% that are not successful, but the 30% that are successful, those are the ones that actually do consider the emotions in the transformation that they go through.
Some of the examples that occur to me, I know I've had clients who are merging two different companies, and ostensibly it's supposed to be a merger of equals. And as the organization goes through that reforming of, hey, what are we going to be? Tons of emotional challenges underneath that. A lot of it under the surface. Like nobody wants to say, I'm worried about losing my job. But what the fear is there, or if this person is shining, well, what is that? Does that take some light away from me, or if there have been layoffs? an organization that has had team members that laid off, there's a huge emotional impact to that. And I can imagine really any time an organization or a team has gone through something that has had a big impact on the emotions of the people in the workplace, I can imagine this process being very helpful to, number one, start with awareness and then move toward productive leveraging of emotional power, I would imagine.
Especially if you want to recover quickly, So I think that, and we actually have a really large communication media company that's going through a major merger right now, and it's going to take them 12 months to figure out this merger. So people are just stuck, like wondering what's going to happen for 12 months, and so that is borderline torture, from a stress standpoint. So they brought us in to help with helping them to manage that somewhat crushing uncertainty that they're dealing with.
So I want to be respectful of your time, Ryan, and so we'll wrap up here shortly. But let me say to anyone who's listening or watching this podcast, I'll include all of your contact information in the show notes so people can reach out to you. I would love, though, to hear, have you ever had it blow up in your face? Have you ever had it just not produce a really great productive experience for people? Because emotions are powerful. It's like, it's like giving someone a shotgun. They can possibly do a lot of damage. I'm not saying that should have happened. I'm just saying any examples of it not going well.
Yeah, I think for sure. there's been,
and you may have to, you may be editing saying, well, but I can't tell that story, and I can't tell that story.
There's I'm trying to think of what's a good. There's plenty of them, but what's a good story to tell. There's definitely different reasons. Some of those reasons can be the way that the program is set up and orchestrated. That's one thing that can sometimes backfire, because you can get into having some pretty vulnerable conversations in these courses. That's part.
I'll go back 20 years during the heydays of emotional intelligence training. I went through, along with a huge team of 55, 60 people, we went through an emotional intelligence training, and a part of that training was to try and get us to be more vulnerable with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And people were encouraged to share what they really thought of each other.
Mm.
They were encouraged to share how they really felt about the business, and the business wasn't always doing great.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to say not surprisingly, noticeably over the 2 years following that training, people who had expressed their sincere doubts about the senior leadership team, sincere doubt, like they'd really shared the source of their fear, the source of their lack of confidence. And those people went away slowly, and it wasn't by their choice. It almost felt like a setup. It almost felt like, okay, I want to, everybody share.
Yeah.
Tell me what's really going on in your head.
Yeah.
And I may use that on you or against you. And I'm not saying that would ever happen with one of your programs, but
I think it's a concern that people have, whether or not it'll happen. I think it's a concern that they have. So we always try to be really thoughtful when we coach our clients about who you're going to have in the room for these sessions and what the relationship is, what are the power dynamics, all those kinds of things. But I have seen it done poorly, and it's gone badly. People are not willing to share things, or they're very skeptical already. Maybe the leadership has already done some things that have kind of eroded trust with the employees, and so they're coming in with, oh, this is something that the leaders want to do. Or I think, like you said earlier, the thing that I hate hearing the most is when I'm in a training session, or I'm listening in on a training session, and I hear the participants say something like, Oh, this is great, but you know who really needs this?
Yeah.
My manager.
Mhm.
That is the kiss of death, in my opinion. That's the worst thing I can possibly hear. And then that means, like, when you're asking when things go wrong, well, there's no credibility. That tells me immediately there's no credibility to the importance of these skills, because they
Yeah.
already know that the leaders don't value these things.
So thank you for sharing that. And Ryan, as I said, people will have the information they need to reach out um, and either just get more information, have conversations. I'm sure almost anybody who is interested in having further dialogue about this in general, you'd be more than open to having a conversation. So I appreciate this. I learned a lot, and it's kind of opened my perspective on emotion powered leadership and how leaders can build their own self-awareness as well as their awareness of others. Very much appreciated. So thank you, Ryan.
My pleasure, Dan. Yeah, it was great talking with you.